Proszę Państwa, myślę, że możemy już rozpocząć. Nazywam się Jacek Bruski.
My name is Jacek Bruski, and I represent the Historical Faculty of the Jagiellonian University, and it will be my pleasure to chair the first part of the panel entitled The Russian Revolution and the Political Upheavals in Central Europe. It is no accident that the title of our conference is the Circles of Revolution, which draws back on the analogy of a stone being thrown in the water that causes circles, concentric circles to appear and move on the water surface. The first circle of the revolution was the territory directly impacted by the revolution in Russia, in the Russian Empire, and the nationalities in it. But the title of this panel is the second circle of the revolution, which is the neighboring countries impacted here in Central Europe by the events in Russia. Now let me introduce the speakers. Professor Lothar Höbelt, who will start this panel. He represents Vienna University. He's a well-known specialist on the history of foreign policy of Austria, Germany, and Britain in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's the author of a very good work on the Habsburgs and Landschaft und Politik in Sudetenland. Then Sławomir Dębski, who has two roles, that of a historiographer and of a politologist, as he is the head of the Polish International Affairs Institute. And he's also very important for the Polish-Russian Center, because he was the first director of the center. Professor Dębski's interests include foreign policy, international relations of Poland and neighboring countries, and especially the relations between Germany and Russia. Mr. Dębski has authored the fantastic work Between Berlin and Moscow about the German-Soviet relations before 1941. And finally, we have Professor Maciej Górny from the Polish History Institute at the Polish Academy of Sciences, who deals with Central and Eastern Europe. And he's mostly interested in the Marxist historiography in Czechoslovakia and other Central European countries. He also deals with the history of science, and one of his recent works is entitled The Great War of Professors in Human Sciences. Now, this is my introduction, and now it's over to Professor Höbelt.
I'll just switch it on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, of course.
All right, good. Now, as you can see from my tie, black and yellow, I'm supposed to talk about the Habsburg monarchy and how they refer to the Russian Revolution. Now, obviously, as a monarchy and its bureaucracy, they weren't basically fond of revolutions. However, of course, this is this marvelous ambivalence that we have about the Austrian attitude towards the Russian Revolution. If revolution happens to your worst enemy, it may be quite a good thing. However, again, there are a few qualifications. Funnily enough, a few weeks before the February Revolution, you have this broad-ranging discussion in the Austro-Hungarian Ministerial Council about what the post-war world should look like. And funnily enough, almost everybody, from the emperor to the foreign secretary, both of them new in their job, Emperor Charles, Count Czernin, they all agreed the ideal to work for in the post-war world is a revival of the three emperors alliance. Germany, Austria, and Russia. And damn the Anglo-Saxons, you know? And the Italians, of course. So they were quite fond of the Tsar because, you know, there are all these stories current that at least the Tsarina is basically pro-German and all these Baltic barons around him and their potential allies. And, you know, we could work with them. And then the Tsar is toppled. And there were all these conspiracy theories, of course, gaining ground within the Central Powers elites, that basically the February Revolution is a British conspiracy. You know, the Tsar wasn't really active enough in the war, and they wanted to replace him by people who were far more committed to the war effort. So that way, the first revolution needn't be a good thing. In the beginning, that's the impression. Then, of course, after a few weeks, they realized that there's now a new left-wing element represented in the Russian government, and they coined this slogan, let's have a peace without annexations, without reparations. Which, of course, is easy to say from a country that's already lost quite a lot of territory. But even so, Charles and Janine, they wanted a compromise peace, exactly along the lines of no annexations, at least no annexations amongst the great powers. They would fiddle with the small print in the Balkans, of course, but that was beside. So they got no real response to this idea, to these peace initiatives from the Western powers, because the French basically rejected it. They said, even if we get Alsace-Lorraine back, if the Germans expand in the east and if an open door in the east, then we basically lost the war. We can't have that. And now they get a response from the Russians who are saying, all right, let's start negotiating on a basis of no annexations. And that sounds attractive to people like Janine. Now, no annexation is a bit difficult because obviously the last panel talked about, Polish independence. There was a sort of Polish independence in the air, of course, because both Kaiser Wilhelm and Francis Joseph had already proclaimed Polish independence. So you couldn't really go back on that. Janine's idea was, all right, we'll take Poland, set up a sort of satellite Poland for the Central Powers, but we'll offer compensation to the Russians by dividing Romania, which we've just conquered. So that might fit the no annexations idea. But the trouble is, with the new Russian government, who do you negotiate with? Is that a stable government? Is there anybody reliable in government you can talk to? And that's why the Germans from the very beginning say it's no go. We need to wait until the dust settles. See who's going to win in Russia in the medium term. We can't negotiate now. And after a few months, even Janine comes round to the point of view saying, all right, situation is far too chaotic. And actually there are Russian emissaries, mostly in the Scandinavian capitals, whom they meet, who say the very same thing, Of course, the socialist or Bolshevik emissaries say, the government is just a pawn in the hands of the Entente, whereas the British diplomats say Kerensky is a German Jew, which of course I don't think he was, but never mind. So you don't know who to talk to in Russia. The old Kissinger question, if I want to talk to Europe, who do I call, If I want to talk to Russia in that situation, who do I call? And then all of a sudden, maybe not all of a sudden for Ludendorff, but all of a sudden for the Austrians, there's the October Revolution. And it happens, of course, at a very appropriate time for the Austrians. They've just scored their victory over the Italians, Caporetto. And just as Charles and William are meeting on the Tagliamento, and on the other side there's an emergency meeting of the Entente in Rapallo, and the day Lloyd George arrives, you hear about Lenin taking power. And you have the Vienna Daily Neue Freie Presse writing gleefully, what a day for the Entente. Caporetto and Lenin on top of it. And with Lenin, of course, you now have somebody who's really committed to make peace at almost any price, only that isn't quite apparent in the early stages. And again, you have a certain dispute between the Prussians and the Austrians. Ludendorff's view is, again, let's wait. Who is Lenin? He spirited Lenin to Russia, as we all know, but Ludendorff's first reaction was, it's a revolutionary group that just happened to get hold of the telegraph. And who knows who's going to be next? Once again, wait. Whereas Janine now has a different idea. He says, let's grasp the opportunity. It's now or never. They all agreed that the Lenin regime won't last. But Janine's idea is, if Lenin signs a peace treaty, the successor government won't dare to tear it apart. That's the idea. The successor government will not conclude peace, but they're probably going to be good Russian nationalists. But once Lenin has made peace, then they will no longer dare restart the war. So this is our chance to get a separate peace with Russia. And if that is so, maybe we'll win the war after all. So that's the idea that Janin's now pursuing, and he's basically successful. There is this running feud, of course, with the Prussian military leadership who want to have a little bit more, you know, like the first Mrs. Trump. I want to have more, you know, so they want to have Estonia and they want to have, but those disputes aren't really so tragic because with hindsight, we all know Lenin would have signed any treaty because Lenin's idea, of course, was the other powers won't last. I mean, it's the monarchies of Central Europe that won't last, and I can sign anything because after a few months we'll have the World Revolution and then everything's different. So they get their peace and in Brest-Litovsk, and there is this ambivalence in the Austrian attitude towards Russia and towards Germany, of course, that Janin is very much opposed to all these annexationist ideas of the Prussian leadership of Hindenburg and Ludendorff. But there's one point, of course, where they are in total agreement. They both want the Ukraine. I mean, Ludendorff wanted a strategic player against Poland partly as a bridge to the Middle East and so on. The Austrians just wanted because of the grain reserves, or the supposed grain reserves, which is why much as there are daggers drawn about other issues, about going into the Baltics or freeing Finland or things like that, they all agreed we need to get the Ukraine, recognize the Ukraine, and actually that is what's called the first peace treaty of World War I, the Brest Peace signed with the Ukraine. So that's the foreign policy picture. After the Peace of Brest, Austria-Hungary really opts out of the debate. Amongst the German leadership, you have a running debate that goes on until almost a breakdown and beyond in the autumn of 1918. You have the Foreign Office that basically pursues what you might call a failed state strategy. They want a weak Russia, a chaotic Russia, a Russia riven by anarchy, because that's no danger. Whereas Ludendorff says, well, Lenin won't last. There'll be a counter-revolutionary regime after that, and we need to make sure that it's our counter-revolutionary regime. So it's best if we put in the regime we want, topple the Bolsheviks and get our sort of white regime in power. And the Foreign Office always says, let's keep on an even keel. The Bolsheviks are right the way they are, and in the long run, interestingly enough, it's the Foreign Office that wins, not the military leadership. The Foreign Office strategy of working with the Bolsheviks, I mean, they have this supplementary treaty in late August of 1918, that is the one that wins out. In that respect, the Austrians no longer count. They no longer have a common border with Russia now. They're only bordering the Ukraine. So they are sort of watching from afar what's happening in Russia. They're not really interfering. They're skeptical about everything, but they only deal with the Ukraine. There's a running debate in Austrian circles whether you should really want a nationalist, independent Ukraine, or whether you shouldn't go with the sort of white Russian tendencies within Ukraine. There's this famous quote by the German Foreign Secretary, funny thing, all our new friends in Russia used to be adjutants of the Tsar, like Skoropadsky and others. So, yeah. So, but that's no longer something where the Austrians really take a part. The domestic aspect, sort of what are the impact of the Russian Revolution on Austrian domestic politics. The interesting thing in a sort of medium-term perspective is that, of course, it increased the value of the Austrian Social Democrats, but what really increased the stature of the Social Democrats was not the Bolshevik Revolution, but the February Revolution. Once you get socialists in the Russian government, and once they start negotiating about a possible peace, once you have this idea about the Stockholm Conference, Janin as foreign secretary, who even though he's far from being a Democrat, he was authoritarian of course, but like many of these people, he still believed in public opinion. And he said, you know, we can't go against the grain of the times. And if there's this tendency now for democracy and all that, we can't really do what we actually planned to do, which is impose a new constitution on Austria from above. Have a coup d'etat, basically, from above, an octroi. And what they had been planning was a new constitution that, to cut a long story short, would have favored the Germans and the Poles of Austria-Hungary. Of course, the Czechs would have hated it. So he said, no go. we can't antagonize the Czechs and we can't antagonize the Social Democrats right now. So the Social Democrats, also the Reichstag, the Reichsrat, the Austrian parliaments being recalled in the spring of 17, the Social Democrats get upvalued by the first revolution, not by the second one. After the October Revolution, supposedly there is some impact amongst the working class movement in Austria-Hungary. They have a wave of spontaneous strikes in January of 1918. And there are rumors and there are allegations, but very few hints that they are actually influenced by the Bolsheviks. Janin has the theory that the Bolsheviks are trying to undermine the negotiating position of the Central Powers by unleashing these strikes and unrest in their domestic backyard. But that's not really, can't really be proven. The basic idea is there are strikes because there are shortages of food, there is hunger, and shortages of food actually are because logistics don't work. We've sent all our rail cars to the Italian front, and before they're back, the people suffer from, so on. So I think the link between the Bolshevik Revolution and that signs of unrest in the Habsburg monarchy, they're very slight. There are a few hopes raised on the part of the Slav nations of Austria-Hungary in the Russian Revolution and their rhetoric about self-determination. So for instance, in the Austrian parliament, questions are asked when the Austrians go about saying, we claim self-determination for Livonians and Estonians, and the Czechs say, all right, and for the Greenlanders next, but why not for the Czechs? And they put their hopes partly on Trotsky, but of course Trotsky, as all the emissaries tell the Austrians, don't worry. Trotsky is not interested in states' rights. He's interested in class warfare, you know. He couldn't care less about the Czechs, and that's the way it is. So the sort of subject nations, to use sort of Wilson's term, of Austria-Hungary don't get anything much out of the Russian Revolution. There are two factors, though, that need to be mentioned in sort of connection with domestic scene of Austria-Hungary and the impact of the Russian Revolution. There's a curious story where we still lack some vital information about the impact of the Russian Revolution on the almost 2 million Austro-Hungarian citizens who were prisoners of war in Russia. We all know about, you know, the revolutionary spearhead, which is the Czechoslovak Legion. Those are about something like 60 or 70,000 people who volunteered to fight for the Entente. You all know the story. They then captured the Trans-Siberian Railway. They become an important ally of the Entente and so on. But they're all an amazing wave of rumors, especially on the part of the Entente, who say, what do the Bolsheviks do to counter that threat from the Czechs? Actually, they are supposedly arming the German and Hungarian sort of loyal citizens who are POWs to fight against the Entente, which means fighting for the Bolsheviks. So that creates the interesting image that it's the conservative, militaristic Germans and Hungarians who are now defending the Bolshevik revolutions against all comers. And that is a huge sort of, you know, idea that's being written about in Entente position papers, but I have never found any study that actually pinpoints there were actually any sizable number of POWs that were armed and equipped by the Bolsheviks to fight their wars. The most you can find are a few thousand Hungarians in faraway Turkestan or so. But the idea that, you know, you have Czechs and Germans fighting their nationality conflict, not in Bohemia, but on the shores of Lake Baikal, would be a funny idea. But apparently it didn't really happen. So that is something, maybe, of course, it's partly a problem about sources. In 1918, of course, fighting for the Bolsheviks may have been patriotic for Germans to do. Once you go back home, by 1921, it stopped being patriotic, it's being subversive. So you no longer write long essays about it. So maybe they simply didn't want to talk about it. That is still partly an open question mark. The other thing, which in the medium and long term maybe is different in Austria, and now I'm talking about the small Republic of Austria that had their elections yesterday, German Austria, no longer the large Habsburg Empire, that is different in Austria from, say, Hungary or Germany, is both in Hungary and in Germany, you have a certain attitude, a certain feeling in the post-1918 world that much as conservatives in Germany and Hungary might loathe the Bolsheviks for domestic reasons, In some ways, they have a common agenda against the victorious Entente capitalistic powers. You have this saying in Hungary that when they are fighting for the Bela Kun regime against the Czechs, all right, our flags are red now, but once we've reached the mountains of the Carpathians, they'll be red, white, and green again, you know, proper Hungarian. And of course, you have this meeting of extremes throughout the Weimar Republic, of people saying we need a national uprising in Germany, and that can actually be triggered by the Bolsheviks. You have this sort of Rapallo politics between, you know, German conservatives, the Reichswehr, and the Soviets, and all that. So that's a current. In Austria, you don't have anything like that, because there's simply no common agenda between the Bolsheviks and the revisionists, if any there are in small Austria. Whatever the Bolsheviks will do, I mean, they may sort of fight the little Entente, they may fight the big Entente, they may help the German Revolution. They're not going to restore the Habsburgs, are they? So the only one actually who thinks differently is the Emperor Charles himself, who actually goes into exile in early 1919. And when he talks to some of his camp followers a few months after, and they're very proud that they have averted a revolution in Austria. They bought off the Social Democrats, and of course the Social Democrats in their turn, they've insisted on keeping the unity of the working class. German Austria is one of the few countries in Europe, apart from Britain maybe, where the labor movement does not split into a social democratic and a communist wing. But it's the social democrats who dominate everything, and the communists never make it beyond a tiny sect. So revolution is being averted. And that is the one thing, funnily enough, here again you have the last link between the Habsburgs and the revolution. When Charles complains about it, he says, you should have let revolution happen, because the revolution could never have survived in Austria. If we'd had a proper revolution, we'd had a proper counter-revolution, and then I'd come back. We're still waiting for him. Thank you.
Professor Höbelt, thank you very much for your presentation. Dziękując bardzo panu profesorowi.
Thank you, Professor, for this. I should also thank you for a very clear presentation of the evolution of Austria's position vis-à-vis the revolution in Russia, especially by describing the impact on the interior policy of Austria-Hungary. For the Polish perception, it's very inspiring and interesting to follow the Austrian opinions, because Austria is perceived in a shadow cast by the German policy. So we are very keen on learning Austria's position towards the events in Russia, and first and foremost in the Ukraine, which is a closer neighbor. Also, the impact of the revolution on the domestic situation in Hungary, Austria, and Germany that the professor flagged up was very inspiring. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like us to move to the next presentation. I now give the floor to Dr. Sławomir Dębski, who will tell us about the threat of Bolshevism in the political language of the Paris conference. Thank you, and I thank the organizers for inviting me here. Indeed, the topic Bolshevism and the Conference of Versailles is a fascinating topic. Since 1960, not too many new voices, indeed, were put into scientific circulation. There is this fundamental work by John Thomson of 1967, which dates back 50 years ago already. Since then, many new sources appeared, or have appeared, which allow us to take a different look at those, at that period, and maybe reinvigorate certain things that had been forgotten. I'd like to start with a quote by Ray Stannard Baker, who was the press spokesman of President Wilson. I will give this in English. To emphasize that forgotten thing about the Paris conference. The quote goes like this.
Russian problem on the Paris conference was profound. Paris cannot be understood without Moscow. Without ever being represented at all, Bolsheviks and Bolshevism was powerful elements at every turn. Koniec cytatu.
Unquote. So please note the term that Baker used, Bolsheviks and Bolshevism. There's distinction between the problem of Bolsheviks and the problem of Bolshevism ushers us into a very big issue of those two terms being used, how those two terms were used during the conference. Actually, four ways of understanding Bolshevism can be distinguished as they were perceived in the diplomatic and political language of the time. Firstly, Bolshevism was tantamount to chaos. We could use the term a failed state using the contemporary political language. It stood for disintegration of the society, of the state organization. So this Bolshevism was a source of fears because it brought with it the elimination, the failure of the state. The second notion, which we tend to forget, and I think it is worthwhile to actually recall it, is the Bolshevism as the instrument of the German policy. The conference started in January 1919. We know that since then the world has accumulated 1 year's worth of experience with the Bolsheviks. When you read the press, you have articles on Russia and on the Bolsheviks' policies every week, appearing every week. Also, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is commented at large. One of the most important topics published in the press is the allegation that the Bolsheviks are the instrument of the German policy, and that treaty is let's say, allegation that but for the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia would have never relinquished the war effort. So there is definitely a connection between the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and Russia switching sides. So this is something, the topic that was criticized rather than the revolution itself. As it was interpreted during the communism times, namely that the imperialist countries intervened in Russia because of the victory of the revolution, thus trying to stem that wave. The reason was, however, quite different. Russia switched sides. They sided with the central countries, central states, so that the intervention in Russia was the continuation of the same war effort that was conducted against the central powers in the Western Front. So it was a logical consequence of that activity.
Bym powiedział, trzecia interpretacja pojęcia bolszewizm.
Now the third interpretation of Bolshevism in the political language around the Paris Conference was Bolshevism as a general idea which was to pull down the prevalent order in the world, and it was of an imperial character. The Bolsheviks wanted to spread to other territories. On the 3rd of October, Karol Radek published the famous article in which he said that the objective of the revolution is to reach out to the brotherly revolution in Germany, and that was the aim of the Bolsheviks, and that they would fight for the same idea along the Vistula River and along the Rhine River. On the 3rd of November, Clemenceau goes to Strasbourg, and in response to these words by Radek, published in many European papers, he says that the loyalty of the people of Lorraine is the best guarantee against that barbarism. And this quotation is a good illustration of the fear of the revolutionary ideas, Bolshevist ideas, spreading not just to Germany, but also to France. Now, when do these fears appear? 11th of November, the Compiègne ceasefire, which basically ended the most important part of the First World War, leads to the, even though it is just an armistice in theory, but the soldiers give up arms and they don't want to fight anywhere. They don't want to fight in France, they don't want to fight in Austria, and also the British soldiers don't want to fight anymore. On the 4th of January 1919, there was unrest in Folkestone, where the soldiers sent on leave were to be brought back to their units, and they riot, they rebel against that decision. They don't want to go to Europe again, don't want to go back in the trenches, and don't want to continue the war. And there was a similar or even more radical sentiment amongst the soldiers who were sent to Russia in the latter half of 1918. The famous memoir of Colonel Fremberg from December, he was a French colonel who was a member of the intervention army in Odessa in the south of Russia, and he wrote in his memoirs about the attitudes among soldiers, and he says the French soldiers who survived Verdun and Marne do not feel like and do not have the will to die for some abstract ideas on the fields of Russia. So the morale was very low. Now, the French intervention was probably the most effective one of all the intervention forces, but in spite of that, the morale of those French units was very low. The politicians who gathered in Paris to talk about the future world order or European order were receiving news about this, and it was very important for them from the point of view of the negotiations that were taking place. And the term Bolshevism, understood in the fourth way at the time, was Bolshevism as a practical problem to be solved. Bolshevism as a problem, as a hindrance to a pan-European discussion about pan-European order. It was seen as a problem because, as a result of it, Russia was not represented during the conference. There were attempts to include Chudenikin and Kolchak, who were representatives of White Russia. As we know, in springtime 1919, Kolchak responded that he does not feel he has the right to talk about the future borders of Russia, and only the new constituents would be able to talk about it. From Wilson's point of view, and from the point of view of the heads of the powers in Paris, that made the whole problem impractical. Wilson had to sail for 10 days on a ship to come to Europe. He was the president of the USA, and he was the first US president who would leave his country for so long in order to participate in some abstract negotiations. I mean, abstract from the point of view of ordinary American citizens. So Wilson could not afford to stay longer than June. And for all practical intents and purposes, Kolchak's response meant that they would not be taken into account during the conference. Now, Russia's participation was very important for Wilson. And the preamble to his proposal on the conference on peace in Russia, which was to be held on the Principe Island, and in the preamble of that proposal, Wilson says more or less that the European powers who wanted to create a European peace are convinced that no peace will be lasting unless there is peace in Russia. So for Wilson, it was a very painful experience to see that his vision of a European order, based on the nation's rights for independence, self-determination, and the creation of their own foreign policy, plus the concert of powers that still had place for Russia, all of that could not become true just because the Bolsheviks were a power that you cannot talk to. So to sum up, one more element that I would like to draw your attention to is the role of the first commentaries on what was happening in Russia. These commentaries were published in 1919, some books, so these were no longer just press articles, but more than that was written. The correspondents who witnessed Russian Revolution started writing books, and the first book of that sort appeared in 1919. It was written by Robert Wilton, who was a British officer who served in the Russian army as the liaison officer. He spent tens of years in Russia and spoke fluent Russian. His father used to have his business in Russia. Wilton received St. George's Order in Russia and so forth. So he was a very well-known person in Russia. And he was also, starting from 1917, he was a correspondent of the Times. So the articles that appeared in the Times in 1917 and 18 were mostly written about him, written by him, about the revolution. And he emphasized certain elements that were very important for British politicians to understand, and also for the American and French politicians during Paris conference. Namely, what he draws their attention to is, first of all, the element of the German conspiracy that's behind the victory of the Bolsheviks, which was a very important element to understand the nature of the revolution. And then the second element he pays particular attention to is that he says that the Bolshevik problem cannot be solved if we do not establish an Israel state. And that's one of the reasons his book was forgotten later on, because he paid attention to the over-representation of Jews amongst the Bolsheviks. So his conclusion was, if the Balfour program is not carried out, then the Bolshevism problem cannot be solved. And he says, we have to establish the State of Israel in order to solve this problem. And finally, he's an author that brings to the light terror. Terror as an element of everyday work, so to say, for the Bolsheviks. Wilton says the Bolsheviks cannot have the reign of the Russian mind without terror and without the fear that's caused by terror. So that's my last comment, and let me just also emphasize a certain element of the public consciousness that was being created by the press at the time. The fear of Russia that we can see in the documents of Paris conference was to a very large extent shaped by what the media wrote and what the diplomats reported on, the diplomats who witnessed the events in Russia, especially the French ambassador in Laon. He wrote his memoirs, or he published his memoirs in 1933, but his impact on Clemenceau and the French diplomacy was very strong at the time. So there was a feeling that the wave of Bolshevism had to be stemmed, and that was what the Polish diplomacy used, trying to present Poland, the idea of reinstating the Polish state, as the only barrier, the only real barrier against the tide of Bolshevism. Thank you.
Chciałem bardzo podziękować panu dyrektorowi Dębskiemu za
Let me thank Mr. Dębski for this very interesting presentation, and also thank you for sticking to the time limit perfectly. Now, I'm very happy that in your presentation you mentioned something that seems to be obvious, but we sometimes forget about it, that the cause of the peace conference in Paris cannot be understood without taking into account the Russian factor. Professor Kornat mentioned this in the first panel. He said there was this very close link between the Polish issue and the absence of Russia from Paris. Let me thank the speakers for presenting different points of view, and also in the last presentation on how Bolshevism was perceived or analyzed at the time. Bolshevism was also considered an instrument of German policy. After the armistice campaign, Germany has been defeated, so Bolshevism is no longer an instrument of German policy, but it may be an ally for Germany. So when the great debate between Clemenceau and Lloyd George about how to treat Germany is underway, Lloyd George used this argument. He said, we must not be so severe with the Germans as the French would like it, because then the Germans would use their intelligence and organizational skills for the benefit of Bolshevism. Thank you. Let me now give the floor to the third speaker, Mr. Górny, who will talk about rebellion in the context of social conflicts in Central and Eastern Europe after 1917.
Dziękuję bardzo. Proszę Państwa, dzisiaj już była krótko mowa o marksistowskiej interpretacji historii, w której
We talked about the Marxist interpretation of history, among other things, where the October Revolution impacted everything, including the emergence of independent state in Central and Eastern Europe. So that was the textbook version of the communist theory, and it included the following elements. First of all, the October Revolution caused a kind of a chain reaction and the rebellion of the working classes throughout the region. And the reason it did not translate into a proper revolution is that they didn't have a mature communist party that would be able to lead these revolutions effectively and take over power. So that was the theory that has been criticized and even mocked on many occasions, but that was the binding theory to start with. And my point today is that it's not to be ridiculed completely, because there are some good elements to it, or some valid points. If we believe that 1917 is the beginning of a long process of social upheaval all the way to the 20s, to the early 20s, throughout the geographical area, most of which was controlled by the Central Powers in 1915, we can see clearly that some elements of this rebellion have got to do with the information coming from Russia, and that it relates to what was happening in Russia. And another valid point in this theory is when we have a look at the reactions of governments. The reactions were very much shaped by what the political elites thought and knew about Russian revolutions. Similarly to Russia, the first instances of social protest started in 1916. The so-called women's rebellions, where women who had to queue to buy goods started rebelling. They started in Krakow and in other places of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
An unfortunate but spectacular accident occurs, the biggest Austro-Hungarian munitions plant is blown up in Pilsen, where at that time it was the women that worked predominantly in munitions plants or factories. At that time, 200 of women are killed instantly, the same number afterwards as the dads had to be removed. So a commission is formed that actually writes a report about the bad working conditions. That includes also the over-fatigued children working there. So this report is presented to the authorities, and the authorities, as obvious as in very similar in all other instances, namely we don't take any steps suggested by the Commission. Instead, we militarize the plant. We subjugate all the employees or workers to the military discipline. So this used to work across Europe, but it didn't this time. In February 2000, in summer 1917, the Skoda workers go on strike, and this is a new quality of the workers' rebellion. Most of the strikers are women, so they come to work, but instead of working at the machines, they would set out to a meadow next to the plant, listening to the speeches of the local social democratic politicians, which are simultaneously interpreted in all the required languages, because the plant has been made international meanwhile, as the workers come from all nooks and crannies of the empire. So that was not only the largest military, or let's say defense factory in Europe. The point is that most of the demands of the workers were met. The workers were successful. The food and resting were introduced. Then a wave of strikes swept Prague and many other industrial cities of Austria-Hungary and also Germany too. And in all successful protests, because there were also some that failed, women participated, which had the practical aspect that they couldn't be conscripted, as it was usually the most popular, most widely used resort. So it seems, based on these examples, that the workers' strike is a powerful tool indeed. Professor Höbelt said that the wave of strikes actually paralyzed the entire military industry. The arsenal in Vienna stopped working. More than 17,000 workers went on strike, followed by Pilsen, Kladno, steel workers, Ostrava miners. So this onslaught of strikes spread. Krakow hunger rebellion followed in January 17, reaching Hungary. A meek consolation for the government was the fact that this protest was the only or the latest manifestation of vitality of the monarchy, because it actually reflected solidarity of the workers all across the empire from many nationalities. The leaflets distributed in Jur in Hungary, the workers were called to show solidarity with our compatriots in Vienna, although they spoke a different language. So these banners that draw the workers together are not very complicated, neither do they seem very exorbitant. The main demand was to abolish the decree about the limitation of issuance of flour for baking bread. That was difficult to meet because the flour was really scarce, and if a striking group successfully sort of cashed this demand in, another group of strikers would potentially emerge because they were left short of flour. The next demand that came up was that of peace. People knew rumors about Lenin's demand of peace without, or fair peace without contributions and so on. So in winter 1980, everyone could read in Austro-Hungarian press about the cause of the Brest-Litovsk negotiations to see for themselves from this astonishingly objective reporting that the Russian party wants to have a quick peace, whilst the Central Powers demand demand territorial gains, and they protract the matter. This is something that the workers could indeed read in the press. The most important thing about the first wave of great strikes was the change in the way how the authorities responded. Previously, violence was applied, military regime was imposed on the plants, the workers were disciplined, but this striking wave was so potent and so strong that the workers learned about how powerful they are. So this protest couldn't be stopped. It reaches Hungary about May 1st. The authorities barely managed to contain the general strike by military repressions, but that was the swan song altogether, because another strike sparks up in Bohemia pretty soon.
Obserwują nie tylko urzędnicy upadających już mocarstw.
So this is observed by the authorities, but also by the activists of nationalistic movements, who learn quite quickly.
To w zasadzie ona jest taka sama, to znaczy przeważnie jej nie ma.
So soon there is no forceful reaction to those strikes. The authorities, Austro-Hungarian Empire authorities, give concessions to the demand of the strikers. The same holds true for the demands of the nationalists, including the same striking workers very often. Then the workers' protests spread on to the occupied territories too. That land, however, is not an industrialized country, but those parts which are industrialized, such as the Polish Kingdom or the Riga, are deindustrialized before the German Austrian occupation. So this strike is not very dangerous to the authorities because the production is not very strong. So the strikes actually, it is actually the unemployed who go on strike. So it's not threatening to the superpower. So strikes everywhere with the same demands. Demands are bread and peace. But already in February, they start taking up a different hue. After the peace statements or the peace treaty statements with Ukraine are announced, these strikes become anti-Habsburg, which is very unpleasant surprise for Vienna, because early in the 18th century, Krakow and Lwów and Vienna, so in 1918, people demand bread and peace, and this is exactly what was negotiated in all with Ukraine. Then the people go on strike again, showing that they don't like this agreement, which is strange. The reports by the Austrian administration show that surprise, either openly or concealed. I will quote now a report on the protests from February 12, 1918 in Lublin. The banners carried by the procession and the speeches leave no room for doubt that the attitude towards both occupying powers is not friendly. Contrary to the assertions of the socialist activists about the peaceful character of the demonstration, an individual burned the portraits of both emperors. A minor did it, and he was never found. What follows is the general strike in Galicia, which is another stone or milestone on the road towards the changing role and nature of the strike. Early in 1917, the strike becomes not only a protest weapon, but also a communication channel. Normal communication channels stopped working, and various groups of interest, not only the lobbyists, but also workers and peasants, farmers, expressed their interest by strikes, by protesting, because they assumed that other communication channels wouldn't be effective. So the whole result of this communication process demise leads to everybody going on strike, be it in the cities, be it in the rural areas. What is very dangerous is that so-called black strike, which entails farmers stopping feeding cattle. Bakers in Kielce stopped working, which in turn sparked the local workers' protest. Also, the prisoners in one of the Krakow prisons go on strike. Also, concierge protests, miners in 1919 and 20 go on strike recurrently. In Romania, a strike paralyzed the entire railway network. At the same time, the suburban rail stopped working in in Warsaw and in Łódź, as the Slovak army fought the invasion of Hungarian Bolshevik, the Slavsky mining area went on strike. The following year in Ostrava, the same miners protested as a reaction to the rumors that Ostrava might be actually given to Poland rather than to Slovakia, to the Czech Republic. So there is many strikes, including the oil area in Borisov, in Poland, the printers and publishers go on strike, tram workers. Also, the armed authorities, including police force, go on strike. When we read the reports from Budapest about the formation of the government by Károly, when the government sent the police to squash the demonstrators, the police refused and even established a labor's union, which actually sided with the protester and also, together with the telephony operator, supported the revolution.
In January 19, the socialist trade unions in Tworki, which is a mental institution, started a strike. The nurses left the beds of the patients, and it had to be militarized, and by this it was not by establishing military discipline, but basically soldiers took over, and the soldiers had to take care of the patients. So to sum up, these strikes normally had very basic demands. It was about living issues or livelihood, and also things that I would not even consider worth striking for. For example, one of the places in Mazowsza region, people were striking because they wanted little windows to be made in their rooms because no air was coming in. It was difficult to air the rooms. So that was the sort of thing people would go on strike about. And most of these were responded to by the government by printing more money and trying to react somehow, but obviously the post-war hyperinflation was originated from this printing of money. Now, something that was another element of this movement in the provinces, which was much more dangerous for the government, was the riots that started right before the Great Strike of Pilsen. Right before it, there was a wave of riots that had all the hallmarks of people's justice, as it's called. So, for example, the participants in the riots would rob shops and then hand out the goods taken from the shops to the passers-by. Václav Šmídka, a Czech historian, has recently published an interesting book on the period. And he says that words like democracy or republic were given new meaning. For example, he quotes a woman who's robbing a shop or stealing in a shop in a Czech town. The woman says, "I like this republican system that we have." So, in some places, this is being organized somehow. For example, counteraction by the shop owners. in some places, especially in the provincial Moravia and Bohemia, and in some of the Polish provinces where the shops were mostly owned by Jews, they also have this hue or tinge of anti-Semitism. Now, coming back to the main question of our panel, and if we look at what place in what was happening here the two Russian revolutions had, or what impact they had, well, first of all, the strikers knew about the revolutions at some point, but for a very long time they didn't have too much serious information. They would establish workers' council, for example, but they didn't really know what to do with them in a way, and this revolutionary know-how was brought back after people were repatriated from Russia who saw these councils there. Now, where the Soviet impact can be seen more is in the government's very delicate reaction. They were apparently afraid of causing a revolution burst out. So, in a way, the government was very cautious and was not giving a very harsh reaction. So these waves of protests, in a way, were brought down thanks to this cautious and guarded reaction. Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for this very detailed presentation of this question. And thank you for the very good balance you showed in going from the general to the detail, because in spite of giving us lots of details, you never lost track of the overarching perspective. And I think it's particularly important to point to this lack of obvious connection between the social upheaval in especially the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and the Russian Revolution. I mean, there were interactions, but as you pointed out, very often these interactions were very complicated or indeed paradoxical. The paradox, for example, sometimes is that when the Treaty of Brest was mentioned, the Treaty of Brest was an attempt of using Russian Revolution to put out local revolutions in Austro-Hungary. So the rulers of Austro-Hungary sign these two treaties with Russia, revolutionary Russia and revolutionary Ukraine, and they are sometimes called the corn treaties, because the problem really was about providing supplies, and it was expected that these two revolutionary countries would feed Austro-Hungary and thereby prevent a revolution in Austro-Hungary. Now we have 15 minutes for discussion, and I encourage everybody to ask questions.
Pan profesor Kuk.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you. I have a question and two comments to what Mr. Dębski said. This was a very interesting presentation that presented in a nutshell, a very systematic way, our knowledge. Now, when you talked about the reasons of the intervention, you mentioned that for the Western allies, it wasn't the nature of Russian Revolution that was dangerous, or its character in the first months, because it was very unclear and unfathomable. But what they were most afraid of was the signing of a separatist peace with Germany, which was not, that wouldn't mean that Russia would join Germany, but Russia would no longer be one of the allies, and that was a deadly threat for the allies. Now, as way of a side comment, let me also say that perhaps that is why Allies yielded to the Soviet Union so much in the Second World War, to Stalin, because they were always afraid that perhaps the scenario of the First World War would be repeated and that the Soviets would sign peace. In 1944, Allies in Western Europe wouldn't probably be able to cope with Germany on their own, not yet, not in 44. So that's why they were afraid of USSR discontinuing the fight. Now, if we come back to the revolution, it happened after the armistice, really. In other words, after, well, August, September 18 was when it was known that Germany was going to lose the war. Towards the end of the year, or in autumn, it was kind of obvious they were going to lose the war, and that's where the bulk of the revolutionary activities happened. So could you comment on this? And secondly, you also mentioned that after the First World War, armies no longer wanted to fight. The First World War was horrid for them. These days we understand it with hindsight. But it was a terrible shock at the time. And this is particularly true about the Central Powers, and especially the German army in the East. There are many memoirs that show that the German army in the East was very disciplined until the very last day, and then literally on the day of signing the armistice, that army turned into marauders, in a way, nearly overnight. And my other comment is about what you pointed out, which was the fear of the Bolshevist Russia at the peace conference. It multiplied by the uncertainty around what was happening in Russia. And just a word of comment from me, and this is nothing new, but basically this fear of Russia has had a very long history, and a very interesting history. The fear of Russia, the fear of Russia's imperialistic position in Europe was born in the 18th century. It became stronger in the 19th century, and then on to the 20th. So at first there was fear of the Tsarist Russia and its expansionism. This was mostly in the second quarter of the 19th century, or even all the way up to the Crimean War. Diderot, for example, or the work by Grison and others, and Michel Cador as well, for example. But there was also another fear of Russia, that was the fear of the revolutionary Russia, which was a vulnerability. So the Tsarist Russia was considered vulnerable to revolution. It was considered to be easy prey for a revolution. And that would bring to the light the real face of the Russian society. So in 17 or 18, that was just a follow-up of that long history of fear of Russia. Thank you. And over to Professor Sergeyev.
To let everybody have their lunch. The first question is to Professor Höbelt. Have you heard anything about the proposal made by the Austro-Hungarian government to Kerensky? Because according to his memories, in his memories he wrote that there was such a proposal for peace negotiations in the autumn of 1917, before the downfall of the provisional government. And the second question to Professor Dębski. How can you comment on the reaction of the Bolsheviks to the declaration of Balfour? I mean, the declaration signed or declared by Balfour on November the 2nd, 1917. What was their reaction? Because, as we know, a lot of American bankers, Jewish bankers, supported the Bolsheviks and supported and spoke in favor of their acknowledgement of acknowledged by the Western powers, by the Entente. How comment on this?
Dziękuję. Proszę.
Thank you. Over to you, Professor. Two short comments, if I may.
W związku z tym, co mówił Sławomir Dębski, jedna refleksja.
A thought I had about what Mr. Dębski said.
Mimo tego obrotu słowem bolszewizm w dyskursie.
Even though the word Bolshevism was used in the public discourse, Versailles did not emerge from that fear. There is a book that you may know by the so-called revisionist history, Arne Meyer. Peacemaking of 1919 is the title, and his proposition is that the Versailles Order developed from fear of Bolshevism, and the nation-states of our region were strengthened to create this cordon sanitaire. But this was not the case. The French policy towards Poland was dictated by wanting to have an anti-German barrier rather than anti-Russian. And secondly, something that the Polish politician Dębski mentioned about the incorporation of Eastern Galicia to Poland, and the fear of Bolshevism was used there perfectly. First of all, we received this territory for 25 years, and then we incorporated it. So this is a model example. Now about Maciej Górny's presentation. These were very real events, but the question is, and this is something we talked about with Professor Wrońska, the question is, was that the result of being tired with an unprecedented, horrible war? So were these protests the result of being tired, sick and tired of it, or was it because Lenin's teachings were used? I personally believe it's the first case, not the second. And also, this social upheaval was not only fought against by the police. In Poland, there was some very wise social welfare decrees issued by the head of the government, and a lot was achieved thanks to these welfare provisions or welfare laws, and that also contributed to our future statehood. Thank you. I'm afraid we can't take any more questions, but I can't see any hands in the air, so now it's time to give the floor to the presenters. Let's start with Professor Höbelt.
All right, thanks. No serious offer from the Austrians as late as September. They were insisted, like negotiating April, May. After August, it had all shifted. There was no serious offer from the Austrians at that point. Which brings me back to one thing that I missed mentioning in my talk, is of course one of the good things for the Austrians of especially the Bolshevik Revolution was it eased their position in Poland. You know, the Polish conservatives had always been about the Austro-Polish solution, because who knows if the Tsar doesn't come back, then they're all traitors. Once the Tsar's definitely gone, and there are even stories that he's personally released some of those princes from their oath of loyalty, they can join the Austrians. And of course the Austrians, you don't want to be run by the Austrians, but you do if the alternative is Ludendorff or Lenin. And that's the charm of the Austro-Polish solution. You're either the Prussian military or the Russian revolutionaries. So you all opt for the Austrians. And even though, and that brings me to this Polish uprising as it almost was in February 1918, after the Peace of Brest, when we simply gave away Chelm. So, the idea. Well, the Austrian government at the time needs either the Social Democrats or the Poles to support them in parliament, which is why on both counts, both against the striking workers and against the rebellious Poles, they adopt a very cautious approach because they need their politicians in parliament next time round, which is one of the reasons why they treat rather softly. And even though the Poles are very angry about Helm, with reason, the Warsaw government that had been installed by the Central Powers actually tells the Austrian Poles, please go on supporting the government because we need the Austrians as a balance against the Russians and the Prussians. So the Russian Revolution helped the Austrians very much in that manner. There's one quote about this Balfour Declaration thing. Sebag Montefiore in his Jerusalem book says, if only Lenin had taken power 2 weeks earlier, there would have been no Balfour Declaration, because it was no longer necessary to work with Jewish Russian public opinion. And one sort of question or comment addressed to Professor Dębski, I remember this one nice quote from Karel Kramář, the first Czech prime minister after the war, who of course didn't much like Poland as a sort of anti-German ally of the French, and he always told the French, you're kidding yourself if you think you won the war. You've only won the war if you've restored the Tsar. Because if not, then the Germans have lost Poznan, but you've lost Russia. And unless you can get the Russian alliance back, you've lost. You're kidding yourself.
Bardzo dziękuję. Pan profesor Dębski.
Bardzo krótko kilka tych uwag na temat.
Now, very quick remark about the intervention of allies in Russia.
Bardzo łatwo nam przyjmować teraz takie interpretacje.
It is easy to now adopt interpretations such as that after November 1918 everybody was sure that was over. Of course, the soldiers wanted the war to end, but if we take the main commander-in-chief of the Entente, Bernhard Foch, he was assertive that war ends only when peace is declared. He wanted to blackmail Germany all the way to the end to enforce better peace conditions. Also, in the Balkans, in Hungary, the process of demobilizing the German army was taking place, supervised by the French. The Polish liaison to Piłsudski go to Budapest to purchase arms, because it's in Budapest where the seat of the Expeditionary Corps of France is located, which disarms the Mackenson's army, and this is the source of arms for the Polish army. So this war somehow continues from the military viewpoint, and the operation in Russia is still the continuity from the perspective of the General Staff of France. This is the same war that goes on. Secondly, the threat of Bolshevism in the German army. Everybody sees where it can lead to. There was also a fear that this rebellion could spread on the French soldiers, on the Allied soldiers. Foch put a lot of emphasis on maintaining discipline against the military, because he said that in spite of winning the war, they could lose the peace because of this anarchistic or Bolshevik contagion that was spreading. And he deemed it very realistic that it also spreads over France. Balfour's statement and the Bolsheviks' statement, I have not studied that problem. But intuitively, I presume that the Bolsheviks regarded the Balfour's Declaration as the imperialist, as yet another imperialist attempt. They believe that the creation of nation-states period is over, and here comes the advent of the class revolutions that will disband national states. So the idea of creating a new national state again, they regard as an absurd idea from the mechanics of history point of view. And finally, the term Bolshevism used by the Polish diplomats. In many aspects, for example, the pogrom of Jews in November 1918 was explained by the Polish diplomacy by the influence of Bolsheviks, manifesting itself in the general upheaval and elimination of discipline, like the soldier undisciplined masses of soldiers started to rob Jewish shops. That was the explanation. I think that the fact that Poland should have served as the bulwark against Bolshevism is far-fetched, but politicians and diplomats tried to find a way of creating such a bulwark, such a dam against Bolsheviks at all. The Polish government in 1918 and 19 attempts to have a contingent of the US Army sent to Poland to secure the communication line between Gdańsk and Poland so that the marching troops could be secured. And we finally learned that Halle's army came to Poland, returned to Poland on a different way and not through the Gdańsk harbor. But that was at the time a very important argument. And secondly, in the conflict with the Ukrainians, the Poles used the argument that the Ukrainians were almost Bolsheviks, so the Allies should actually side with Poland because the Ukrainian army was created by the Germans and now are supported by Bolsheviks. So this is another occurrence where the term Bolshevik is used by the Polish diplomacy. And finally, the idea of the Polish-Romanian alliance appears in the context of the Bolshevik threat. Bolsheviks were defeated around Odessa, they withdrew from Russia, so what to do to create a barrier there? We should create a Romanian-Polish barrier that will offer Europe at least a partial solution to safeguard its eastern, southern borders. Thank you for that, especially for emphasizing the use of Bolshevism as a scaremonger, that's a scaremongering topic, which was indeed profound. I know, thank you, I know that I'm standing before you in lunch, or sitting rather. I do agree that it was the general exhaustion with war rather than Bolsheviks' inspiration that led the workers on strike. But then again, there are examples of very progressive legislation. Caroly, for example, started by actually splitting and dividing up his land, real estate amongst the farmers, peasants, but that didn't help him to consolidate his government. So in that time of turmoil, the government wanted to stabilize, first and foremost, to reinstitute the authorities, the administration. Whether this new state is going to be more or less progressive, this is something that becomes important only at the later stage of the development. Firstly, you need to catch your breath. So thank you very much for those contributions. I thank very much to the participants and to the audience. And now I announce the lunch break. Let's meet at 1:30 after lunch. Thank you.